I was going to pray up a storm this morning, but we already got one, right? Or preach up a storm, maybe. Yeah. Last week, we talked about the heart of David. Do you remember? And how he was faithful and he was humble. And because he was those things, God was able to put him exactly where he needed to be. And David did his best in service to Saul and everywhere he went. And if you remember what we saw about Saul last week, he was somewhat broken and being tormented by a spirit. Well, this week, as we move into chapter 17 of 1 Samuel, we get a bigger glimpse of what's going on in Israel during this time. Because Israel, as you probably remember, has been fighting off enemies for about their whole existence. I'm sure they were battle weary, don't you think? And sometimes they were successful and sometimes they weren't successful. Sometimes Saul was a great leader and sometimes he cowered in the corner, it seems. And there's a little something confusing when we get to the end of the chapter because it looks like Saul doesn't know who David is. So I'm just going to give you kind of a heads up before we get there. And what we learn from that is that it's possible that these stories about David in the early years are not necessarily in chronological order, that they're different stories about what happened, but they may be mixed in terms of a timeline. So I just want to give you a heads up so you don't go, that doesn't make sense, okay? But what we do know is that during this time, David was probably traveling back and forth between Saul and his father's home and the sheep in the fields and the battlefield. But David is still a pretty young guy and the youngest of his brothers. And so he has a long life ahead of him and many adventures to come. But I think that that chapter 17 is probably one of the best known stories of David that there is. And it's the story of David and Goliath. Have you heard of it? You see, we all know the story of David and Goliath, don't we? Even people who didn't grow up in church have heard of David and Goliath, right? And so it's funny because a lot of the Old Testament stories people don't really know, and then they know some stories and they know the lesson that goes with it, and that's a powerful thing. But I think there's something for us to learn that goes even deeper than what people normally know. So this morning, we're going to look at the whole chapter of 17. And so I hope that you'll hang with me as we try to look at it with fresh eyes. And keeping in mind that Israel at this time is a nation in need of a hero, someone to lead them into victory. So let's read starting in 1 Samuel 17 with verse 1. It says, the Philistines now mustered their army for battle and camped between Succoth in Judah and Azekah at Ephes. Look at that, Ephes Dammon. So Saul countered by gathering his Israelite troops near the valley of Elah. So the Philistines and Israelites faced each other on opposite hills with the valley between them. Then Goliath, a Philistine champion from Gath, came out of the Philistine ranks to face the forces of Israel. He was over 9 feet tall. Now, let me just stop you there for a minute. Some translations believe that he was more like 6'9", and that's based on later or earlier copies of the text that were found. So we don't really know if he was 9 feet tall or 6'9", but either way, he towered above the Israelites who were not known for their height, right? He wore a bronze helmet, and his bronze coat of mail weighed 125 pounds. He also wore bronze leg armor, and he carried a bronze javelin on his shoulder. The shaft of his spear was as heavy and thick as a weaver's beam, tipped with an iron spearhead that weighed 15 pounds. His armor-bearer walked ahead of him, carrying a shield. That is quite a picture of Goliath, isn't it? I mean, this was an impressive guy. His just his bronze coat weighed like a person, right? I'm like, and so I don't know what kind of army that the Philistines had with the rest of them, but this guy by himself was enough to scare everybody, right? And in my head, it kind of looks like the Hulk And if you saw Thor Ragnarok, and they would have the champions come in to fight against whatever opposition there was, and the Hulk would like grab the enemy and kind of go, ba-doom, 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 you know. That's my picture of Goliath. And so I don't think that he had an alter ego like the Hulk does, but an impressive enemy for sure. And in those days, very often, armies would settle things, sometimes by sending their biggest and strongest warriors to fight it out against each other. And so that's why Goliath is then standing up representing the Philistine army, kind of in a who you got kind of way. And so Goliath was definitely the one to beat and the one who could beat everyone, and he knew it. Goliath stood and shouted a taunt across to the Israelites. "Why are you all coming out to fight?" he called. "I am the Philistine champion, but you are only the servants of Saul. Choose one man to come down here and fight me. If he kills me, then we will be your slaves. But if I kill him, you will be our slaves. I defy the armies of Israel today. Send me a man who will fight me." And when Saul and the Israelites heard this, they were terrified and deeply shaken. If only they had someone who was tall, who was a brave warrior, who was a skilled fighter. I don't know. Do you suppose they had someone like that? Do you suppose the one who was chosen as king, because do you remember why he was chosen as king? Because he was tall. Yes. So who is the most likely person to fight Goliath? The very king himself, right? But instead of stepping up to fight him, instead of leading his army, Saul and the Israelites are terrified and deeply shaken. I think Goliath is quite the intimidator. So much so that they're all shaking in their boots because of what he said. It's really quite a picture, isn't it? That here he is against this whole army and they're cowering together. Meanwhile, David was the son of a man named Jesse, an Ephrathite from Bethlehem in the land of Judah. And Jesse was an old man at that time, and he had 8 sons. Jesse's 3 oldest sons, Eliah, Abinadab, and Shimeah, had already joined Saul's army to fight the Philistines. David was the youngest son. His 3 oldest brothers stayed with Saul's army, but David went back and forth so he could help his father with the sheep in Bethlehem. So David is the youngest of 8 sons. He's probably not old enough to be in the army, but there are his 3 oldest brothers who are fighting. And do you remember back when Israel said they wanted a king, and God's like, "You don't really want a king," and they're like, "No, we want a king." And he said, "The king is going to take your best and your strongest to fight in his army." And that's what you have here. So the oldest brothers have been called to the battlefield to join Saul's army. And David is far too young to do that. And so he's stuck going back and forth and tending to the fields and to the sheep. For 40 days, every morning and evening, the Philistine champion strutted in front of the Israelites. One day, Jesse said to David, "Take this basket of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread and carry them quickly to your brothers. And give these 10 cuts of cheese to their captain. See how your brothers are getting along and bring back a report on how they are doing." David's brothers were with Saul and the Israelite army at the valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines. Finally, David gets to go to the battlefield. So David left the sheep with another shepherd and set out early the next morning with gifts, as Jesse had directed him. He arrived at the camp just as the Israelite army was leaving for the battlefield with shouts and battle cries. Soon the Israelite and Philistine forces stood facing each other, army against army. David left his things with the keeper of supplies and hurried out to the ranks to greet his brothers. And as he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, came out from the Philistine ranks. And then David heard him shout his usual taunt to the army of Israel. Isn't this a funny picture? Because like all the Israelites, they've gone home and slept in their bunk beds for the night, and now they're heading back out to the battlefield. Yeah, with all their battle cries, and they're big and they're bad and they're ready, and this looks like quite the battle getting ready to take place. And out steps Goliath and says his words. He's just talking smack, right? And he's talking to him, and so then they're frozen at the battlefield. I just think that's hilarious. Just the thought of them walking out like, yes, we're going to war. And then they stand there on the sidelines shaking because this one guy comes out. And as soon as the Israelite army saw him, they began to run away in fright. Oh, have you seen the giant? The men asked. He comes out each day to defy Israel. The king has offered a huge reward to anyone who kills him. He will give that man one of his daughters for a wife, and the man's entire family will be exempted from paying taxes. So how is Saul responding to this big, scary giant that's coming out to threaten him? He's going to pay somebody who's brave enough to stand up to him. Maybe someone else will be tall enough or brave enough. I think David's kind of in shock at this point. He asked the soldiers standing nearby, What will a man get for killing this Philistine and ending his defiance of Israel? Who is this pagan Philistine anyway that he's allowed to defy the armies of the living God? Well, that's big talk coming from a little guy, isn't it? And these men gave David the same reply. They said, yep, that's the reward for killing him. But when David's oldest brother, Eliab, heard David talking to the men, he was angry. What are you doing around here anyway? He demanded. What about those few sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? I know about your pride and deceit. You just want to see the battle. Does that sound like anybody else's older brother? He's not too thrilled that David is there. And what it occurs to me when I read this is that there are always going to be skeptics in our lives, aren't there? There's always going to be people who are annoyed because you show up, especially if they're not brave enough to show up themselves. His brother is one of those who are running away or standing there and shaking, and all of a sudden his little brother comes in and says, who's this guy that you guys are afraid of him? And so what does the brother say? Shut up, squirt, go home, right? Who do you think you are? David says, what have I done now? I was only asking a question. And then he walked over to some others and asked them the same thing and received the same answer. You see, David's not giving up, is he? And then David's question was reported to King Saul, and the king sent for him. So here we see David and Saul together again. David, the one who would dare to question who this guy is that would intimidate the Israelite army. And David meets with Saul and he says, don't worry about this Philistine. I'll go fight him. Don't be ridiculous, Saul replied. There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy, and he's been a man of war since his youth. But David persisted. I've been taking care of my father's sheep and goats, he said. And when a lion or a bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and rescue the lamb from its mouth. And if the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and club it to death. I've done this to both lions and bears, and I'll do it to this pagan Philistine too, for he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and bear will rescue me from this Philistine. Do you hear David's faith in that? He's not afraid. He's faced enemies before. He's ripped things from the mouths of bears and lions. But do you hear what he says? It was the Lord who rescued me from them. And he can do it again. Saul finally commented, all right, go ahead, he said, and may the Lord be with you. I don't think Saul really believed that. Then Saul gave David his own armor, a bronze helmet and a coat of mail, and David put it on, strapped the sword over it, and took a step or two to see what it was like, for he had never worn such things before. I can't go in these, he protested to Saul. I'm not used to them. And so David took them off again. And he picked up 5 smooth stones from a stream and put them into his shepherd's bag. And then, armed only with his shepherd's staff and a sling, he started across the valley to fight the Philistine. And that right there, my friends, may be the biggest walk of faith you've ever seen. This boy without armor, marching across the battlefield where the Israelite army stood on the sidelines shaking, heading towards the giant who threatens them all. Not because he was confident in his own abilities, but because he was confident in the God who went with him. Goliath walked out toward David with his shield bearer ahead of him, sneering in contempt at this ruddy-faced boy. Am I a dog, he roared at David, that you would come at me with a stick? And he cursed David by the names of his gods. Come over here and I'll give your flesh to the birds and wild animals, Goliath yelled. And David replied to the Philistine, you come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Today the Lord will conquer you, and I will kill you and cut off your head. And then I will give the dead bodies of your men to the birds and wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. And everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, but not with sword and spear. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us. Whoo, David can talk some smack too, can he? Yeah? As Goliath moved closer to attack, David quickly ran out to meet him. And reaching into his shepherd's bag and taking out a stone, he hurled it with his sling and hit the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank in, and Goliath stumbled and fell face down to the ground. And so David triumphed over the Philistine with only a sling and a stone, for he had no sword. And then David ran over and pulled Goliath's sword from his sheath and used it to kill him and cut off his head. Whew, David. What kind of faith is that? He stepped out because he knew that God was stepping out with him, didn't he? The rest of Israel's armies would be running away by now. But instead of running, David stood his ground and took the stone out of his pouch and hurled it. Where was the guy's shield bearer, right? Wasn't he supposed to block it, right? I wonder how far away it was. But here's the thing. Who do you think won that battle? Did David win the battle? No. God won the battle, didn't he? It might have been David wielding the stone, but it was God who landed it in the giant's forehead, wasn't it? David had about a 0% chance of beating Goliath in battle on his own. But he won. Because the battle was the Lord's. And as David said, the Lord will conquer you. Now, if David had fought with great skill and strength and might, then it may have looked like this was some great accomplishment because of his abilities. But that's not how it was at all. Maybe even if Saul had stood up to fight, who was probably more his equal anyway, and Saul had won, Saul would have gotten the glory. But instead, here stood this boy with nothing but a rock and a sling. And so everyone watching would know that the God of Israel was there, and he was victorious that day. His conquest was brought about by the faith of his child. Look who runs now. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they turned and ran. Ah! And then the men of Israel and Judah gave a great shout of triumph and rushed after the Philistines, chasing them as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron. And the bodies of the dead and wounded Philistines were strewn all along the road from Sharam as far as Gath and Ekron. And then the Israelite army returned and plundered the deserted Philistine camp. David took the Philistine's head to Jerusalem, but he stored the man's armor in his own tent. And as Saul watched David go out to fight the Philistine, he asked Abner, the commander of his army, Abner, whose son is this young man? Didn't notice when he asked that question, as David went out to fight, Saul is going, who is this guy? This guy that walks with such faith. And Abner replies, I really don't know. We'll find out who he is, the king told him. And as soon as David returned from killing Goliath, Abner brought him to Saul with the Philistine's head still in his hand. Tell me about your father, young man, Saul said. And David replied, his name is Jesse, and we live in Bethlehem. But who was his real father? The Lord of Israel's army. And the battle belonged to him. Isn't that an amazing story? Even more amazing because it's a true story. So you know how this summer we did parables and those were fictional stories made up to teach a point? This is a true story. This is what really happened. And that is an amazing, incredible story, isn't it? And it's very easy for us to think that it's a story about the little guy standing up to the big guy and winning. That's not it. And in our culture today, when we talk about David fighting Goliath, we talk about the little guy showing up against the big guy or the big corporation or whatever it is. That's not it. That's not what we learn from this story. What we learn from this story is that when it is the Lord's battle, the Lord wins. Not with sword and shield, but with his own power and his own might and his own will, which is stronger than anything on this earth. Do you agree? I think we love the story of David and Goliath because we love to see an underdog win, don't we? When that little guy goes up against the giant, we want him to win. Everybody loves an underdog. Maybe even more so because we can relate to him. But here's what I want to tell you today. We are not the underdogs because we are the children of the Most High God. You see, this is not a story about the underdog. This is the story about the God who rules over Israel and over us. And when he fights the battle, he will not lose. I want to encourage you today because I know that many of you feel like you are facing Goliaths in your life. Do you? Maybe your Goliath is a bully at school who threatens you and takes your lunch money. Or maybe Goliath is a mound of financial debt that you can't seem to dig out of. Your Goliath could be a diagnosis that threatens to take you down, or the lack of a diagnosis. Or it could be an addiction or a mental health issue that taunts you day and night. You see, I think we all have Goliaths in our lives at some point. We all have these giants that we know we can't fight. And the enemy loves to stand before us and taunt us, doesn't he? You're not going to win. Sit down. Go home. Who do you think you are? You're not going to dig out of this hole. You're never going to be any different. That relationship's not going to be restored. Whatever it is, you see, Goliaths love to taunt us, don't they? That's just how the enemy works. And if we listen to the Goliath and we listen to the voice of the enemy, we can start to believe that he is right. That we don't have what it takes. That we should just be back at home. That we should give up and walk away. Even easier when you can look back and see others on the sidelines who are just shaking in fear. But we are not the underdogs because the battle is the Lord's. And so whatever battle is going on in your life, make it the Lord's battle and not yours. Because if it is his battle, he's going to fight for you. Do you believe that? How many times do we sit there in our defeat and go, I guess God's just not going to do anything? Let me tell you, friends, if the battle is his, he will win. But it is up to you whether you give that battle to him or not. Because you see, Goliath was there and Israel was there, and they decided it was their battle instead of the Lord's. Funny that this same army had watched the enemy troops kill each other and run off in chaos when Jonathan and his armor bearer were the only ones who showed up. Do you remember that? The Lord did that. And these people had seen how God had worked on their behalf in some of the most miraculous ways. And yet there they stood on the sidelines going, we're not big enough. We're not bad enough. We can't beat this enemy. That is a lie. The enemy wants you to convince you that it's your fight, that it's your battle, that it's your Goliath. And if it belongs to you, then you can't help but listen to his voice, the enemy's voice, right? Man, I'm never going to get better. Man, I'm never going to get out of debt. Man, I'm never going to have joy again. Man, I'm never going to feel better. Is it your battle or is it his? And this is what I love about David. David never marched out onto that field saying, look at me. Did you hear what his brother said about you? I know how proud you are. What were the words that he said? I can't even remember the words he said, but he's like, you're proud and deceitful or something like that. It was exactly the opposite of what we know about David, right? David is humble. David is faithful. He didn't come onto that battlefield going, you guys are a bunch of weenies. I'm going to go show how bad I am. He didn't do that, right? His brother would accuse him of that. But instead, he went saying, this is the Lord's battle. How dare you defy the Lord of Israel? Who do you think you are that you can defy the God of gods and Lord of lords? Because let me tell you, friends, there is no enemy that God can't beat. There is no battle that he can't win. And you know how we know that? Because even when Jesus Christ went to the cross and died, and it looked like the battle was over, even when they took his body down and put it in a tomb and said goodbye forever, the battle wasn't done. Because 3 days later, Jesus came out of that tomb, didn't he? Do you believe that? 3 days later, Jesus came out of that tomb. And you know what that means? That God is so powerful that he defeats even death. And if that's who our God is, then we have nothing to fear. If God is fighting the battle for you, who will you fear? If God is on your side, who can defeat you? I don't think God ever shows up to a battlefield and goes, oh, well, I lost that one. Do you? No, because there is nothing, no one, nobody, no army, no obstacle in this world that he can't defeat. Nothing. The key is, do you know who's fighting for you? And are you doing it yourself, or are you letting him do it? Because when the battle is the Lord's, he always wins. This morning we're going to have a time of worship and prayer as we always do. Some of you need to pick up your swords and lay them down at the altar and say, God, I can't fight this one on my own. I need you to fight it for me. Some of you need to quit looking for a way out. Somebody to trust who's going to do it for you. Stop looking for a hero when the hero already died on the cross for you. And instead pick up a stone of remembrance. And say, when I come against an enemy, I'm not going to quake in my boots. I'm going to hold on to the things that the Lord has done for me in the past, because he did it before and he will do it again. And if David was safe from the lions and the bears and every other battle he fought as a child, then how much more was he safe when he stepped out on God's behalf? And my friends, so are you. You pick up his stones, the ones that remind you of his goodness and what he's done. and you march across that battlefield. Will you do that? And if that needs to start with you by laying down something at the altar, then it's just like David walking across the field. He didn't stand on the sidelines and yell. He stepped onto the battlefield first, knowing that when he did, God would come. And so today is your day. What battle are you facing? Are you going to step out in faith, or are you going to sit on the sidelines and quake in fear? The decision is up to you. We're going to go and we're going to worship, and we're going to turn those things over to him today. And you're going to say, Lord, it's your battle, not mine. Lord, it's your child, not mine. Lord, it's your disease, not mine. Lord, it's your depression, not mine. And I can't wait to see the victory that comes. Will you pray with me? Father God, we love you so much. And we thank you for this example of what faithfulness looks like in David. And Father, we are guilty sometimes of being more like that army that sits on the sidelines and wonders what we can do and who will help us and how are we going to get out of this situation. And Father, you are there with the answers and the power and the might every time. And so I pray on behalf of this congregation, those who are hearing this right now, God, that if there is a Goliath in their life, that they would not back down in fear, but that they would stand in faith, calling upon the name of the Lord of Lords and God of Gods. And Jesus, we thank you that you defeated every enemy when you defeated death. We want that power in us, the power to win, the power to heal, the power to love. We give it all to you this morning and ask that you would take our battles and make them yours. In Jesus' name, amen. If you